Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. The Syrian Civil War, Russia's adventure in the Syrian Civil War, now France and Great Britain and Germany, three fundamental parts of NATO, engaged in the Syrian Civil War, bombing campaigns, intelligence gathering, in coordination with Russia. This is a puzzle because it conjoins with the president's remarks when these days passed about the American strategy, the American policy towards the Syrian civil war, fighting the Islamic State, Daesh, but also al-Nusra, al-Qaeda, and the other kindred of Cain in the area against the Assad regime, for Turkey, against ISIS, against al-Nusra. Many cross references here, and we're very pleased to welcome Michael Doran, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Malcolm Hoenlein, Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, is here with me, keeping score. Michael, we've got scorecards out here. So, your interpretation of the president's address these days past about his strategy. Any change, any significant change that we can expect in the weeks and months ahead? Good evening to you, Michael.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for having me. No, I think there was no significant policy change in the address. The address basically said, I am staying the course. We're on the right course. Things are eventually going to work out to the best. I think he felt compelled to make the address because he realized that a lot of people were worried, a lot of people were scared. And he wanted to say to the public, listen, I understand your concerns. Don't think that I don't know that we have a big challenge in front of us, but I've got a strategy in place, and it's going to work out in the end.
You've written about the theory on which the president has based his relationship, certainly with Putin, which dictates the policy in Syria and maybe Iraq, and that is that Russia and Iran will come around somehow and cooperate productively with the United States. If I'm stating that correctly, has this theory changed with the experience that they've had over the last couple of years and seeing Russia's aggressive role?
No, it hasn't changed in the least. What the president is saying, the public statement is that Putin is coming around. He's coming our way. You can't quite see him. He's down there a little bit, and he's around the corner, and he's just about to turn the corner. We'll see him soon. Trust me. And this is a way that he balances the demands of allies in the region, like Turkey, like Saudi Arabia, with his desire to actually cut a deal with the Russians, to cooperate with the Russians to the fullest extent possible. And so he pretends that there's a process in place by which the Russians are going to converge with the Americans, and we're all going to unite in a grand coalition against ISIS. I can't see into his heart. I think he probably believes this on some level, that he's kind of, he has access to the great computer in the sky, which allows him to run the numbers and see the interests of all the parties involved, and he sees that ultimately the Russian interest and the American interest are going to converge. It's too bad that President Putin doesn't quite see that yet, but sooner or later he's going to come around, and in the meantime we have to wait. And so he may think that, or maybe he just doesn't want to do anything, and he just and those who are pushing him into a direction that will lead to confrontation with the Russians are unpleasant to him, and so he's come up with this rhetoric. But there's nothing that's happening, nothing that Putin is doing, nothing that we're seeing on the ground suggests that his rhetoric is correct. And at the same time, none of this evidence that things are not working his way seems to be having any effect on his thinking.
But do you agree with some of the people who have said that this is a deliberate policy to enshrine the role of both Iran and Russia in the region? The president, I remember, spoke about Iran as a platform into Iraq and Syria. So do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah. So let me put it in simpler terms, because you said it better than I did. That's exactly what I think. He believes that the region will be better off, and the United States, more importantly, will be better off if we work in a concert system with the Russians and the Iranians. Yes, there will be differences between us and them on some important issues, but it's better that we work to try to cooperate with them, bring them into the system, make the regional security architecture make them stakeholders, give them some responsibility, show them that we don't regard our relations with them as a zero-sum conflict. And when we do that, then over time they will cooperate more with us, and we will work together to contain and defeat ISIS.
Puzzled, Michael. The vice president was in Kiev these days past addressing the Rada, and I very clearly heard him say that the sanctions will remain in place and continue and be strengthened against Russia until and if Crimea is handed back. Other bellicose remarks. How does this compare with what you just told us about the President of the United States, the vice president's boss, looking to work with Russia? Are these two different universes?
No, these are you traditionally. We would think about relations with the Russians in terms of alliances, so we would make connections between what the Russians were doing in the Middle East and what they're doing in Europe and what they're doing elsewhere. President Obama has compartmentalized. So we have a conflict with the Russians over over Ukraine, starting with the annexation of Crimea. And as a result of that conflict, we were forced to put some sanctions in place, and we're not going to lift them until we can come to agreement about, or we can, the situation in the Ukraine improves and the Russians pull back. But the president has made it very clear to the Russians, very clear to them, that he will not allow the conflict over the Ukraine to affect our relations with them in Syria or our relations with them in the Middle East, generally speaking.
What about does Russia's aggressive stance now, selling the weapons, providing to Egypt, to getting involved in a huge way in the Iranian energy sector, and their efforts broader in the Middle East, which clearly have to threaten America's interests, but also long-standing alliances and relationships. So how does that fit in to the perception of Russia's role, and specifically also their competing interests, their own competing interests, whether in Syria or elsewhere?
I can find no evidence in the public statements of the president or the senior advisors that show that they feel that there's a serious competition between Russia and the United States in the Middle East. I think that you and I, traditionally, we would kind of divide up the region into our team and their team, and we would think of Israel, Turkey, Saudi Arabia as allies in the United States, and we would seek to minimize the role of the Russians in the region, and certainly we would seek to contain the Iranians and try to strengthen our allies against the Russians and the Iranians. I see no evidence that President Obama sees it that way. He sees the Middle East as kind of a round table. He wants everyone, including the Russians and the Iranians, seated at that table, and then the job of the United States is to kind of propose settlements to outstanding problems and try to get everybody to work together on them.
That's creative of you, Michael. That's a nice image. Malcolm, quickly, the Iran missile.
Yeah, could you assess what the reaction or the failure to react to the second reported now launch of Iran's missiles, how that is playing out in the region? How do they see then the determination of the West, the U.S.-led West, in confronting violations by Iran?
They see no inclination in the United States to confront violations by Iran. The United States has defined the ballistic missiles tests as not falling within the purview of within the deal. The nuclear deal. There's a separate Security Council resolution, and this is in the interpretation of the administration. It's a separate Security Council resolution that governs the ballistic missile question, and they are taking action, they say, in the Security Council about the ballistic missiles tests on the basis of that other Security Council resolution. But just like they separate the Ukraine question from the Syria question, they separate the ballistic missile question from the from the nuclear question. I mean, that's the rhetoric. The rhetoric is very legalistic and saying that there are these different compartments and we have to behave about each issue in these separate compartments. You step back from that and you look at what the thinking must be behind it, and clearly they are moving like gangbusters to implement the deal before the end of the administration, which means they are looking to transfer $100 to $150 billion to Iran before President Obama leaves office.
Michael Doran is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Malcolm Hoenlein, Conference of Presidents, Major American Jewish Organizations. I'm John Batchelor.